When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said, "Woman, you are set free from your ailment." For a Jew in the first century in Palestine, going to synagogue would have been a lot like us coming to church, but not exactly alike. In first century Palestine, the synagogue was the center of all communal life. Education took place in the local synagogue. News was shared, information was conveyed in the local synagogue. The local synagogue was the gathering place for the entire local community. In commenting on today's passage, Fred Craddock writes, "To be in the synagogue on the Sabbath was to be at the heart of Judaism, in its most prevalent and in many ways its strongest form." The Jewish community was tight. It lived always with the specter of Roman oppression. And so Jews banded together, and the synagogue was at the center of communal life. For a Jew in first century Palestine, his or her individual identity and his or her identity as a member of the Jewish nation would have been formed in the synagogue. And so that's the setting of today's gospel passage. A local synagogue gathered together on the Sabbath for worship. And Luke tells us, "And there appeared a woman with a spirit that had crippled her for 18 years. We can only speculate as moderns as what we would call her ailment with our scientific nomenclature. But Luke's message is crystal clear. The woman had been suffering for 18 years. Kent Hughes writes in commenting on today's passage, "Due to her infirmity, it would have been much easier to stay at home. But to her credit, she sought the solace of worship and the Word." It's an important observation. This woman could have stayed home, but she had the discipline. She had the desire. She knew she belonged with the community of faith in worship on the Sabbath. And for 2,000 years, this unnamed woman has been a model of faithfulness, perseverance, and courage. 2,000 years, people have looked up to this woman. But in real time, it would have been easy enough for her to get lost in the crowd, particularly on the Sabbath day that Jesus has come to speak to the community. It would have been easy for her to be just another face in the crowd on that unusual, exciting day when Jesus of Nazareth, the one we've been hearing about, is coming to us, to our synagogue. She could have been lost in the crowd that day. But Luke tells us Jesus saw her. With everything else going on, with all the excitement, Jesus saw this woman. He saw her need. And once he saw her, everything began to change. Sharon Ring comments on this moment that Jesus' actions bring this woman, quote, "from the margins to the heart of her people." Jesus sees her and responds with the love, the grace, the healing power that comes from God. It would be easy to miss the moment in the passage. There's so much else going on. It would be easy to miss when he saw her. That's when everything began to change for this woman. I can remember a particular week back in the thick of the pandemic. We didn't know then how long the restrictions would go on. We didn't know when we would get back to in-person worship. We were doing the best we could to keep the message of the church positive and encouraging. But it was a tough time for everybody, there's no question. And in one particular week, I got 2 emails from 2 different people, completely independent of each other. And the essence of the emails said this: I see you. With all that's going on, with all the church is having to do to evolve and adapt to the realities of the pandemic, for all that the staff is doing to keep the church moving forward, to keep worship attractive and appealing, even online. One particular week, 2 different emails out of the blue that said, I see you. I will never forget those 2 messages. As brief as they were, they said exactly what I needed to hear. We see you. We know that you all are doing everything you can to keep the church's worship life active and appealing. We all want to be seen, don't we? Particularly in moments of vulnerability, when we're struggling. We all want to be seen, respected, heard, valued. Jesus is our role model. Jesus is our guide. On that day, that woman's face was not lost in the crowd. And her issue was not lost on Jesus. He responded with love. Luke tells us when Jesus laid his hands on her, immediately she stood up straight and began praising God. So all's well that ends well, right? Well, not quite. Luke continues, but the leader of the synagogue, here we go. You've broken the Sabbath rules. You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is for worship only. This had happened before. Jesus numerous times had been criticized for not observing the Sabbath laws strictly enough. Imagine the excitement around a physical and spiritual healing, and yet there was criticism. You shouldn't have done this on the Sabbath. One commentator says about this moment, it's a great miracle, but it's done on the wrong day. Right? Can you imagine objecting to a moment of physical and spiritual healing? How could that even be possible? What's important for us to remember, Sabbath rules were established with good intentions. The opening lesson today speaks directly about honoring the Sabbath. It's a commandment, of course. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Everything that came to be associated with Sabbath observance was formulated with good intentions. But over time, there just kept being nuanced rules added and added. And eventually, enough had been added that people lost sight of why are we honoring the Sabbath to start with? And the regulations about Sabbath observance came to be thought of more as what they forbade than what the Sabbath allowed. Jesus' message was, we can honor the Sabbath day, but how better to honor God than to offer healing for one of God's precious children? I just have the sense here, I wonder what you think about it. This is toward the end of Jesus' earthly ministry. People have been nipping at his heels all along the way about you don't follow Sabbath law closely enough. This is not the first time Jesus has been criticized for working on the Sabbath. I think he's just had enough. When Luke tells us, he says, "You hypocrites." Have you ever just had enough? I have. You just sometimes have to call a halt to it. This is not the first time people have said, you must be from God. No one else can do what you do, but you shouldn't do it on the Sabbath. Jesus says, you hypocrites. He's just over it. And then he says, you will go to the effort of untying your animals, and you will do the work of leading them to water on the Sabbath. And yet you object to my healing this daughter of Abraham. Jesus takes his stand. You hypocrites. With good intentions, he's saying, you've allowed the letter of the law to have more power than the spirit of the law. And that's a temptation we all face to this day. We have policies, we have rules, we have traditions for good reasons. They're important. But it's important for us always to remember, why do we have these? What's the spirit that underlies the letter of the law? Jesus, of all people, loved the Spirit of God. But that love of God in Jesus Christ led to a radical love of neighbor. And the healing of this woman demonstrates the depth of Jesus' compassion for God's children. In Jesus' heart, he surely knew his critics meant well regarding Sabbath observance. But in his wisdom, he knew in looking so closely at the trees, they had lost sight of the forest. Love of God always is to show forth in compassionate love of neighbor. I'll finish with this. There is a lot of content in this passage. There's a lot going on in this gospel lesson. It presents us the reality of illness and pain, realities we must face. It shows us the value of godly compassion. The passage reminds us of the ongoing possibility of allowing the letter of the law to supersede the spirit of the law. The lesson reminds us that there are times when we face unjust criticism, and Jesus models for us how we can respond to unjust criticism in a constructive way. And certainly the passage demonstrates for us the centrality and the importance of regular, disciplined, active participation in the worship life of the church. A thoughtful preacher, a thoughtful teacher could get a series of sermons or classes from today's gospel lesson. But everything else that happens in the passage is grounded in one foundational reality. Jesus saw her. Amen.